I am Helen, 67, and for 31 years, I lived under the comforting lie that my daughter, Chloe, loved me for who I was, not what I owned. That illusion shattered at the Savannah riverfront gala when her husband, Julian, accidentally left his phone line open, exposing their plan to declare me incompetent and seize my life savings. That single slip changed everything. How did I fight back? I didn't argue. I simply awarded my $1.2 million legacy fund to a stranger on live television, leaked Julian's fraudulent tax records, and changed the locks on my cottage. In less than 3 hours, my quiet life became a public battlefield. Julian never saw it coming. He was just sipping champagne in Miami, adjusting his wireless earpiece, entirely unaware that his world had already turned to ash. Before I do, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story earns it. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I like knowing who's out there. The crystal chandeliers of the Savannah Riverfront Ballroom cast a warm, amber glow over the hundreds of guests gathered for the annual Maritime Association Gala. It was the 50th anniversary of the association, but tonight, the grandest tribute was reserved for a single desk in the harbor logistics office. The master of ceremonies stepped to the podium, her voice echoing over the low murmur of conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses. Behind her, the massive projection screens flickered to life, displaying a black-and-white photograph from 1984. In it, a young woman stood on the bustling docks of the Savannah port, clipboard in hand, wind whipping her dark hair across her face as a massive container ship loomed in the background. That was me. 40 years ago, when the river ran a little faster and my knees didn't ache before a rainstorm. A polite wave of applause rippled through the room. I sat at the head table, smiling softly, my hands folded in my lap. The slideshow continued, tracing a lifetime spent in the service of the tides, coordinating arrivals, resolving cargo disputes, and quietly keeping the lifeblood of the city moving. There were photos of retirement parties I had organized, charity drives I had led, and late-night shifts where the only light came from my desk lamp and the beacon of the lighthouse across the water. Yet, as the applause grew louder, my gaze kept drifting to the empty seat directly to my right. A small, elegant place card rested on the white tablecloth. It read, Chloe Vance. The camera panning the head table paused on that empty chair. On the giant screens, the vacancy was stark, a quiet void amidst a sea of celebration. The guests noticed. The whispers began, soft but persistent, like the dry rustle of palmetto leaves in the evening breeze. The event coordinator slipped through the shadows, crouching beside me with a look of quiet concern. She asked if we should delay the presentation of the Lifetime Achievement Award for a few minutes. I looked at the empty chair, then at the clock on the ballroom wall. It was already past 8. I shook my head. There was no point in waiting for a ship that had already sailed for another port. I scanned the room, looking past the polished mahogany tables of the shipping executives and port directors. Near the back of the hall, standing quietly by the service entrance, was a young woman in a simple, dark navy dress. Her hair was pulled back in a neat braid, and she was nervously adjusting the strap of her purse. She looked out of place among the silk ties and evening gowns, but her eyes were fixed on me with a steady, quiet warmth. It was Maya. The daughter of David Lynn, my dearest friend and the bravest man I had ever known. I raised my hand slightly and caught her eye. I motioned for her to come forward. Maya's eyes widened in surprise, and she pointed to herself as if to ask if I had made a mistake. I nodded firmly and pointed to the empty chair beside me. As she walked down the center aisle, the crowd parted, their curious eyes following her. She took her seat with a quiet grace, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out to touch mine. Her father had been a crane operator at the port, a man of iron and silence who had kept me safe through the worst storms of my life. If he were still alive, he would have been the first one to buy a ticket to this dinner. 5 minutes later, the president of the Maritime Association took the microphone. He spoke of dedication, of the invisible threads that hold a community together, and then he paused, looking directly at Maya. He announced that years ago, I had quietly declined several executive pension increases, requesting instead that the funds be redirected into a private trust. It was to be a legacy fund, designed to honor the quiet virtues of loyalty and service to the harbor community. The crowd listened in absolute silence as the president revealed the current balance of the fund, grown through decades of compound interest and matching port contributions. $1,200,000. And tonight, as the founder of the fund, I had chosen its very first recipient. When the president called Maya's name, the ballroom erupted. People stood, their applause thundering against the high ceilings. Maya sat frozen, her face pale, her eyes darting to me in disbelief. She whispered that there must be some mistake, that she couldn't possibly accept such a gift. I simply reached over, squeezed her hand, and told her that her father had already paid the deposit on this legacy 30 years ago. 3 hours later, the celebration was over. The heavy crystal award sat on the passenger seat of my old pickup truck as I sat in the darkness of my driveway, the engine idling quietly. My phone, resting in the cup holder, began to vibrate. Then it buzzed again. And again. When I finally picked it up, the screen showed a relentless string of notifications. 112 missed calls. Nearly all of them were from Chloe, with a dozen more from her husband, Julian. There were text messages, voicemails, and alerts from numbers I didn't recognize, distant relatives who hadn't spoken to me since my husband Arthur's funeral, and local reporters looking for a human interest angle on the massive corporate gift. I turned the phone face down on the worn fabric of the seat. The story that had unfolded on the local television broadcast that night didn't begin in the grand ballroom of the Riverfront Convention Center. It had begun 6 years earlier, in the quiet rooms of the historic cottage where Arthur and I had raised our daughter. Arthur and I had always believed in a quiet life. We didn't care for the grand houses on the marsh or the sleek European cars that the newer logistics managers drove. We believed in solid oak furniture, Sunday mornings at the local chapel, and summers spent crabbing off the public pier. Chloe had grown up wanting for nothing, but she had grown up believing we were ordinary, perhaps even poor, because we chose to invest in her future rather than our own appearance. When Arthur passed away after a sudden, devastating stroke, the silence in our home became a physical presence. For me, the grief was a slow, steady ache. For Chloe, who was 31 and newly married to Julian, it seemed to spark an urgent need to distance herself from the modest world we had built. Julian was a man who lived in the margins of other people's wealth, always searching for the next venture, the next connection that would elevate his boutique wellness brand into the high society circles of Savannah. Slowly, the visits from my daughter became scheduled appointments. Then, they became excuses. There was always a retreat in Atlanta, a marketing seminar in Charlotte, or a dinner with potential investors that couldn't be missed. When Chloe did visit, Julian was usually waiting in the car with the engine running, or Chloe would spend the entire hour glancing at her phone, her mind already miles away. She wasn't unkind, but she treated her visits to my small cottage as a chore, a tax she had to pay to maintain her conscience. I never complained. I told myself that young marriages require focus, that building a business is a demanding master. But a mother notices when her daughter stops asking for her advice, when birthdays are marked by generic floral deliveries instead of phone calls, and when the simple traditions of a lifetime are discarded like old newspapers. Then came the announcement of the Golden Anchor Gala. The Maritime Association wanted to make a grand gesture of my retirement, planning a live broadcast to highlight the port's history of community leadership. When I drove to Chloe's house to hand-deliver the invitation, I found her packing leather suitcases into the back of their luxury SUV. Julian was on the porch, talking loudly on a wireless earpiece. Chloe looked at the gold-embossed card, her eyes widening slightly when she saw the scale of the event. She promised me she would be there. She hugged me, her perfume expensive and unfamiliar, and told me she wouldn't miss it for the world. I believed her. Because no matter how many times a child pulls away, a parent always keeps the porch light on, hoping this is the night they finally come home. But 24 hours before the gala, the phone had rung. Chloe's voice had been bright, filled with that forced cheerfulness people use when they are about to break a promise. She told me that Julian had secured a last-minute invitation to a private yacht show in Miami, an unparalleled opportunity to pitch their wellness spas to international developers. They were leaving the next morning. I had stood in my kitchen, looking out at the old pecan tree Arthur had planted when Chloe was born, its leaves whispering in the humid southern air. I asked if they had already booked the flights. There was a long pause on the line, the kind of silence that confirms a lie before it is even spoken. Chloe murmured that they had no choice, that Julian's business was at a critical juncture, and that, people like us, had to seize these moments. I didn't argue. I didn't tell her how much the empty chair would hurt, or how the executives would look at me with pity when the cameras rolled. I simply told her I understood, and wished her a safe trip. When the call ended, I sat in the quiet kitchen and remembered something Arthur used to say when Chloe disappointed us as a girl: never write a letter when you are angry, and never make a decision when you are hurting. So, I didn't call her back. I didn't send a message of guilt. Instead, I reached for my address book, turned to the section marked with faded ink, and called Maya. When Maya had answered the phone the night before the gala, her voice was warm, carrying the faint, tired rasp of someone who had spent the afternoon projecting over the hum of small motors in a high school workshop. I had hesitated, suddenly feeling the weight of my own vulnerability, but before I could even formulate the excuse to back out of my request, she had cut through my silence. "I'll be there, Mrs. Vance," she had said, her response instant and absolute. "You don't even have to ask. I would be deeply honored to sit with you." No hesitation. No checking of digital calendars, no tactical pauses to weigh the social utility of her evening, and no complaints about the short notice. Just a simple, unconditional promise. When I hung up the phone, the silence of my kitchen didn't feel quite as heavy. I had known Maya since she was a quiet, skinny 10-year-old who used to sit on the edge of the concrete pier, her legs dangling over the murky Savannah River while her father, David, and I worked the late-shift cargo transfers. David Lynn was not just my colleague, he was the brother I had never been born with. We had started at the Savannah Port Authority within months of each other in the early 80s, an era when the docks were still ruled by heavy paper ledgers, grease-stained manifests, and the sheer physical grit of the men and women who worked the river. David had been a crane operator, one of the best on the eastern seaboard. He lived in a tiny, weathered cottage 3 streets down from ours, and our families had merged into a single, seamless unit. We shared Sunday potlucks, helped each other patch leaking roofs after summer storms, and watched our daughters grow up together. But while my Chloe had always kept her eyes fixed on the grand, historic mansions of the Gaston Street elite, Maya had been content with the grease under her fingernails and the salt on her skin. Then came the late August of 1993. A sudden, unpredicted tropical depression had swept up the coast, catching the harbor mid-shift. The wind was howling at 70 miles an hour, turning the shipping containers into massive, unstable blocks of steel. I was inside the temporary logistics shack on the edge of Dock 4, trying to secure the final paper manifests, when a massive microburst sheared the cables of a nearby gantry crane. The structural failure was instantaneous. A stack of 3 40-foot steel containers began to tilt directly over my office. I remember the terrifying screech of twisting metal, the sudden darkness as the power lines snapped, and the absolute certainty that I was about to be crushed. But David didn't run for the storm shelter. From his elevated cab, he saw the containers shifting. With a level of precision that defied the raging winds, he swung his own crane spreader bar, wedging it against the falling stack. He held the crushing weight of 40 tons of steel in place for 90 agonizing seconds, just long enough for me to throw myself through the shattered window of the shack and scramble onto the wet asphalt. The strain stripped the gears of David's crane, causing a partial collapse of his own carriage. He survived the impact, but the injuries left him with a permanent limp and a quiet, stoic acceptance of his own mortality. When an aggressive form of lung cancer claimed him 15 years later, he didn't complain. On his final night in the hospice wing, after the nurses had stepped out, he had reached for my hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong. "Look after my girl," he had whispered, his eyes clouded with pain but fiercely focused. "You don't even have to ask, David," I had replied, the tears hot against my cheeks. She will always have a home. He had smiled, a slow, fading expression of absolute trust, and closed his eyes for the last time. Maya was 19 then. She had inherited her father's stubborn pride and his refusal to be a burden to anyone. When I offered to pay for her college tuition, she had politely but firmly declined, choosing instead to work 20 hours a week stocking shelves at a local marine supply store while carrying a full course load at the state university. She lived on instant noodles and wore thrift store coats, but she graduated at the top of her class with a degree in vocational education. Instead of taking a lucrative corporate job with one of the major logistics firms, she chose to teach maritime mechanics and robotics at a struggling public high school near the docks. Some of our old colleagues thought she was wasting her intellect, but I knew better. She was building a harbor of her own, giving kids from the riverfront neighborhoods a chance at a life beyond the streets. And she never forgot me. Every Christmas, a handwritten card arrived in my mailbox. Every spring, she would show up in my driveway with a truck bed full of mulch and a toolbox, quietly repairing my porch steps or cleaning my gutters before I even realized they needed attention. Just paying the rent on my childhood memories, Mrs. Vance, she would say with a grin, wiping grease from her forehead. The morning of the gala, I had arrived at the Riverfront Convention Center nearly an hour early, my heart heavy with the knowledge of Chloe's empty chair. But when I pulled my truck into the gravel lot, Maya was already there, standing near the entrance. She was wearing a simple, deep navy dress that had clearly been pressed with extreme care. It wasn't silk or designer label, but she carried herself with a quiet, unshakable dignity that made the passing executives in their tailored tuxedos look remarkably small. "You look beautiful, Maya," I said as I climbed down from the cab. She blushed, offering a shy smile. "I hope this is appropriate." I had to borrow the shoes from a colleague. She reached into her canvas tote bag and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in tissue paper. "I wanted you to have this. It's not much, but, well, it belonged to my dad." I carefully unwrapped the paper. Inside was a vintage brass pocket compass, its casing worn smooth by decades of sea salt and David's rough hands. The glass was flawless, and the needle spun with a steady, true precision toward the north. Engraved on the inside lid in David's own rough hand was a single line, "To the anchor of our harbor." My throat tightened, and for a moment, the humid Savannah air felt hard to breathe. I looked up at Maya, my eyes brimming with tears. "He would be so proud of the woman you've become." "I just try to keep my heading true, Mrs. Vance," she whispered, her own eyes shining. "Just like he did. Just like you do." I slipped the compass into my evening clutch, its cool, heavy weight a physical anchor against the storm of emotions swirling inside me. I offered Maya my arm, and together, we walked through the grand glass doors of the convention center. The ballroom was a dazzling display of wealth and prestige. The air was thick with the scent of expensive floral arrangements and heavy perfumes. As we made our way toward the head table, I saw the curious glances from the port board members and their elegant wives. They looked at Maya's simple dress, then at the empty chair beside me that bore my daughter's name. I could see the silent calculations happening in their eyes. They knew Chloe, they knew her ambitious husband, Julian, and his desperate attempts to secure their investment for his failing wellness spas. They knew the Sterlings should have been here, standing beside the woman who had given 40 years of her life to the harbor. But as I sat down, with Maya on my right and the heavy brass compass resting safely in my bag, the pity of the crowd lost its sting. The empty chair was no longer a symbol of my daughter's neglect, it was a space waiting to be filled by the truth. The hum of conversation in the ballroom died down as the lights began to dim, leaving only the soft, golden glow of the table candles flickering against the polished silverware. A quiet hush fell over the 400 guests as the massive projection screens at the front of the hall illuminated. The tribute video began with a panoramic shot of the Savannah harbor at sunrise, the morning mist rising off the water as the massive container ships glided silently toward the docks. Then, the images shifted to the archives. There I was, decades younger, standing in a cramped, wood-paneled office surrounded by towering stacks of paper manifests, a heavy black rotary phone pressed to my ear. Another photograph showed me standing beside Arthur on the day we bought our small historic cottage in the downtown district. We looked so young, our faces unmarked by the tragedies and triumphs that lay ahead. In the photo, Arthur had his arm wrapped tightly around my waist, his smile wide and full of an uncomplicated happiness. Behind us, a tiny Chloe, barely 3 years old, was sitting in the grass, her face smeared with chocolate ice cream. My chest tightened at the sight of Arthur's face. He had been gone for 6 years, but there were moments, like tonight, when his absence felt as sharp and immediate as a sudden draft in an old house. The slideshow moved through the decades, capturing the steady, unglamorous rhythm of a life dedicated to the port. There were photos of me presenting safety awards to young dockworkers, coordinating emergency logistics during the hurricane of '99, and standing beside retired crane operators at their farewell dinners. I had spent 40 years organizing these celebrations for everyone else, always content to remain in the shadows, ensuring the machinery of the harbor ran without a hitch. Tonight, the spotlight was finally turned on me, and the warmth of the applause that echoed through the grand hall was overwhelming. Yet, as the video played, my eyes kept drifting back to the empty chair on my right. The small white card bearing Chloe's name seemed to catch the light from the screen, a stark reminder of the distance that had grown between us. The camera crew, panning the head table to capture the reactions of the guests, paused on the empty seat. On the giant screens, the vacancy was displayed for the entire room to see. The contrast was undeniable, a lifetime of community service celebrated by hundreds of strangers, while my own daughter chose a yacht show in Miami over her mother's defining moment. The murmurs in the crowd were soft, but I could hear them. In a city like Savannah, where family history is currency and social standing is meticulously observed, an empty seat at a tribute dinner spoke louder than any speech. Richard Holloway, the president of the Savannah Maritime Association, stepped up to the microphone. Richard was a man of the river, having started his career as a deckhand before working his way up to the executive suites. He adjusted his glasses, looked out over the audience, and then turned his gaze toward me. For 40 years, Helen Vance has been the quiet compass of our logistics operations, Richard began, his voice deep and resonant. She is a woman who never sought the spotlight, who never asked for recognition, and who consistently put the welfare of this harbor and its workers ahead of her own advancement. The crowd applauded warmly, but Richard raised a hand to quiet them. Many of you know Helen as the master coordinator of our shipping channels, he continued. But what many of you do not know is the quiet, unseen sacrifice she made behind the scenes. 12 years ago, when the board offered Helen a series of significant executive promotion packages and retention bonuses, she approached us with an unusual request. She turned down those personal financial increases. A collective murmur of surprise rippled through the ballroom. I kept my eyes lowered, my hands folded tightly in my lap. I hadn't wanted this part of the story to be told, but Richard had insisted that the truth deserved to be known. Instead of accepting those bonuses, Richard said, his voice softening with genuine respect, Helen asked the company to invest those funds into a private, restricted trust. She wanted to create a legacy fund that would honor the values of loyalty, quiet sacrifice, and service to the harbor community. She called it the Anchor Legacy Fund. The projection screens shifted, displaying the official charter of the trust, dated more than a decade ago. Over the last 12 years, Richard explained, through careful management, matching contributions from the Port Authority, and private donations from retired executives who learned of Helen's gesture, that fund has grown. Today, as Helen officially steps down from her desk, the Anchor Legacy Fund stands at $1,200,000. The ballroom fell into an absolute, breathless silence. Even the catering staff stopped clearing plates, their eyes fixed on the stage. The charter of this fund gives Helen a unique privilege, Richard said, smiling warmly. She alone has the authority to select the very first recipient of this legacy. And tonight, she has made her choice. Richard looked toward our table, his eyes resting on the young woman sitting in the seat that had been reserved for my daughter. Maya Lin, would you please join Helen on the stage? Maya froze. Her face went entirely pale, and she looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Mrs. Vance, I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling. I smiled, reached over to take her hand, and stood up. "Come with me, Maya," I said softly. The applause began slowly, a hesitant wave of hands that quickly built into a thunderous, standing ovation as Maya and I walked up the steps to the stage. The bright stage lights were blinding, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Richard handed me the heavy crystal golden anchor award, its facets catching the light like a prism, before stepping back to let me speak. I leaned toward the microphone, my voice steady despite the rapid beating of my heart. 30 years ago, a brave crane operator named David Lynn held 40 tons of falling steel in place to save my life, I said, looking out at the sea of faces in the audience. He never asked for a reward. He never complained about the injuries that cut his career short. And when he passed away, his only concern was the future of his daughter. I turned to look at Maya, who was standing beside me, tears streaming down her face. Maya did not inherit a fortune, I continued. But she inherited her father's character. She spent the last 15 years working late shifts, teaching our harbor's children, and quietly showing up on my porch whenever I needed a helping hand. She didn't do these things for money or recognition. She did them because she is David Lynn's daughter. I took Maya's hand, her fingers cold and shaking in mine. "If anyone deserves to carry the legacy of this harbor into the future," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "it is Maya. It is my privilege to present her with the inaugural Anchor Legacy Award of $1,200,000. The ballroom erupted. People were standing on their chairs, cheering and wiping away tears. Maya covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as the weight of the moment finally broke through her reserve. Richard stepped forward, presenting her with the official certificate of the trust, his face beaming with pride. "I can't accept this, Mrs. Vance," Maya sobbed into my shoulder as she threw her arms around me. "It's too much. I don't deserve this." "Your father already paid the price for this, Maya," I whispered into her ear, holding her tight. "You just had the grace to show up and collect it." By the time the gala concluded and I finally made the quiet drive back to my historic cottage, the clock on the dashboard of my pickup truck read 11:30. The humid Savannah night was still, the only sound the distant, rhythmic lowing of a foghorn from the river. I parked the truck in the gravel driveway, turned off the engine, and sat in the darkness for a long moment. The heavy crystal award rested on the passenger seat, a silent witness to the evening's events. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the dark cab of the truck, displaying a relentless, scrolling wall of notifications. 112 missed calls. There were dozens of text messages from Chloe, their tone shifting rapidly from casual confusion to outright panic. There were voicemails from Julian, his voice undoubtedly strained as he realized the financial implications of what had just been broadcast live on the local news. The story of the 67-year-old port dispatcher who had bypassed her own daughter to award a $1 million legacy to a schoolteacher was already spreading across the city. I turned the phone face down on the seat, climbed out of the truck, and walked up the creaking wooden steps of my porch, leaving the noise of the world outside in the dark. The heavy oak door of my cottage had always kept the damp river air at bay, but tonight, the atmosphere inside felt thick, charged with an unspoken reckoning. I had barely finished hanging my formal lace shawl in the hallway closet when the gravel in the driveway crunched violently. High-beam headlights swept across the living room walls, casting long, distorted shadows of the window panes against the pine floorboards. I didn't have to look outside to know who it was. The aggressive purr of the luxury SUV's engine died, followed by the sharp slam of two car doors. A moment later, the screen door rattled. Chloe walked in first, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and defensive anger. Behind her came Julian, his tailored linen suit crumpled from the hurried drive back from the airport, his jaw set in a tight, hard line. He didn't look like a man who had just returned from a luxury yacht show, he looked like a creditor whose primary asset had just dissolved into thin air. Mom, Chloe began, her voice cracking slightly as she stepped into the warm light of the kitchen. What did you do? My phone hasn't stopped ringing since we landed in Jacksonville. People are sending me clips of the broadcast. They're asking why some schoolteacher was sitting in my seat. I stood by the kitchen counter, resting my hands on the cool, worn wood. Your seat was reserved, Chloe. I held it for as long as I could. But a seat at a tribute dinner, much like a place in a family, cannot remain empty forever. Julian stepped forward, his voice low but vibrating with a controlled fury. Helen, let's not play semantic games here. We are talking about $1.2 million. A legacy fund that you quietly controlled for over a decade. Do you have any idea what that kind of capital means? Sterling Wellness is in the middle of a critical expansion. We were pitching international developers in Miami tonight to secure our future, and you gave it away to the daughter of a port laborer on live television. Julian, I said, my voice remaining entirely calm, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in his eyes. That money was never yours to allocate. It was a fund built from my declined promotions and the compound interest of 40 years of my life. It was designed to honor loyalty. Maya Lin has spent the last 15 years showing up for this family, for this harbor, and for me. She didn't ask for a dime of it. That is precisely why she earned it. She's a stranger. Chloe cried, her eyes filling with tears of frustration. You publicly humiliated us, Mom. The entire maritime board, the logistics executives, our friends, they all saw that empty chair. They think I abandoned you. Did you? I asked softly. The question hung in the humid air of the kitchen, heavy and undeniable. Chloe flinched, looking away from my gaze, her eyes landing on the old family photographs lining the hallway. We had business, Helen, Julian snapped, stepping between Chloe and me as if to shield her from the truth. A real business that supports your daughter. You could have warned us. You could have told us there was $1 million trust on the line. We would have cancelled the Miami trip in a heartbeat. I know you would have, I replied, looking directly into Julian's ambitious, calculating eyes. If there was a price tag on my affection, you would have been the first in line. But I wanted my daughter at my retirement because she loved me, not because she was waiting for a payout. I walked past them, my footsteps echoing softly on the hardwood floor, and entered the small study at the back of the house. From the bottom of the built-in bookshelves, I pulled out 2 heavy, vintage leather sea chests. They were old maritime trunks that had belonged to my grandfather, their brass corners tarnished with age, their leather straps cracked but strong. I dragged them into the living room and placed them on the low coffee table. Julian and Chloe watched in silence as I unbuckled the heavy straps of the first chest. Open it, Chloe, I said quietly. With trembling hands, Chloe knelt beside the table and lifted the heavy lid. Inside were not gold coins or stock certificates, but the meticulous, paper-bound history of her own life. There were decades of harbor logistics logs, handwritten in my own precise script during the graveyard shifts I had volunteered for to earn double-time pay. Beside the logs lay a stack of faded savings ledgers, dating back to the year she was born. What is all this? She whispered, picking up a yellow tuition receipt from her private academy. That is the record of your freedom, I said. Every semester of your education, every textbook, every meal plan. I worked the midnight shifts at the port so you would never have to carry a student loan. Look deeper. She reached into the chest, her fingers brushing against the mortgage documents of her first condominium, the loan papers where Arthur and I had quietly co-signed and paid the interest for 3 years until she and Julian could afford the payments. Beneath those were the invoices from her wedding, the historic Savannah venue, the catering, the floral arrangements that Julian's family had claimed to coordinate but which Arthur and I had quietly funded from our retirement savings. You never told me you paid for the reception hall, Chloe murmured, her voice dropping to a whisper as she stared at the paid-in-full stamp on the invoice. Julian said his partners handled it. Julian didn't know, I said, glancing at my son-in-law, whose face had gone remarkably still. Arthur and I didn't want you to start your marriage with a debt of gratitude to us. We wanted you to believe you had built your own success. But somewhere along the way, Chloe, you started believing that your success meant you no longer needed the people who laid the foundation. I reached into the second seat chest and pulled out an antique brass marine chronometer. It was a beautiful, heavy instrument, its gears ticking with a faint, rhythmic precision that filled the quiet room. Your father gave me this when I completed my 25th year at the port, I said, placing the chronometer on the table beside the ledgers. He told me that time is the only currency we can never earn back. Once you spend it, it's gone. I spent 40 years of my time ensuring you had everything you ever wanted. And when I asked for one afternoon of your time, just one afternoon to stand beside me while I said goodbye to my life's work, you told me you were too busy. Chloe covered her mouth with her hand, a soft sob escaping her lips. The anger had completely drained from her face, replaced by a sudden, crushing weight of realization. She looked at the ledgers, the old photographs of her childhood, and the ticking chronometer, and for the first time in years, she saw her mother not as a social obligation, but as the woman who had sacrificed her own youth to build hers. "I'm sorry, Mom," she wept, her shoulders shaking as she collapsed against the edge of the table. "I'm so sorry. I didn't think. I didn't realize." Julian looked at his wife, then at me, his expression hardening as he realized he had lost control of the narrative. "Chloe, get up. We don't need to do this. This is a guilt trip. She's trying to make us feel guilty for building a life." "No, Julian," Chloe said, her voice stronger now as she wiped her eyes and stood up to face him. "She's not making us feel guilty. We are guilty. We left her alone on the day she was honored by the entire city so we could go to a yacht show. We didn't care about her. We only cared about what we could get from her." Before Julian could respond, a soft knock sounded at the front door. I walked over and opened it to find Maya standing on the porch. She was still wearing her navy dress, but she had wrapped a simple cardigan around her shoulders against the damp night air. In her hands, she held a warm, covered dish. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Mrs. Vance," Maya said softly, her eyes darting to Chloe and Julian in the living room. I figured with everything that happened tonight, you probably didn't get a chance to eat dinner. I brought some of my dad's favorite crab stew." "Thank you, Maya," I said, stepping aside to let her in. "Please, come in." Maya walked into the kitchen with a quiet familiarity that spoke of 100 Sunday afternoons spent in this house. She didn't ask where the plates were, she simply walked to the cabinet, pulled down 3 bowls, and began to set the table. She knew the exact drawer where the silverware was kept, and she knew that the kitchen faucet leaked if you didn't turn the handle twice to the right. Chloe watched her, a look of profound sorrow in her eyes as she realized that this young woman, whom she had dismissed as a stranger, knew her mother's home better than she did. The kitchen felt incredibly still after the screen door rattled with the force of Julian's departure. He had demanded that Chloe leave with him, his voice sharp with the panic of a man who realized his influence was slipping away, but she had remained seated at the worn wooden table. She didn't look up as the gravel in the driveway crunched under the tires of their SUV, the headlights sweeping across the kitchen window one last time before disappearing into the dark Savannah night. Maya quietly finished setting the table, her movements gentle and deliberate. She placed 3 bowls of the warm crab stew on the table, along with a basket of fresh bread. There was no grand speech, no dramatic declaration of victory. We simply sat down together, 3 women bound by the memory of 2 men who had spent their lives working the river. At first, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the brass marine chronometer on the sideboard and the clinking of spoons against ceramic. But as the warmth of the food settled into the room, the silence began to soften. "I don't remember the last time I sat in this kitchen without looking at my watch," Chloe said softly, her fingers tracing the grain of the oak table. She looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "I used to think that every minute had to be traded for something else. A connection, a business lead, a stepping stone. I forgot that some minutes are just meant to be lived." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. You didn't forget, Chloe. You were just navigating by the wrong stars. It happens to the best captains when the fog rolls in. In the weeks that followed, the change in my daughter was not sudden or theatrical, but steady, like the rising of the tide. She and Julian separated quietly. There were no bitter arguments in public, no dramatic legal battles over the remnants of their struggling wellness spas. They simply came to a mutual understanding that they were charting entirely different courses. Julian remained focused on the high society circles of Atlanta and Miami, while Chloe moved into a small apartment near the historic district, only a few blocks from my cottage. She began to call me every morning. At first, her voice carried a tentative, cautious note, as if she were waiting for me to bring up the past or demand an accounting of her years of neglect. But I never did. Guilt is a heavy anchor, and I had no desire to keep my daughter chained to her mistakes. One Saturday morning, she showed up on my porch carrying a pair of old, rusted crabbing nets that had belonged to Arthur. "The weather is clear," she said, offering a shy, hopeful smile. "I thought maybe we could go down to the public pier. If you're not too busy." I smiled, stepping inside to grab my straw hat. "I've been waiting for Saturday for 6 years, Chloe." We spent the afternoon on the wooden pier, the salty river breeze tossing our hair as we lowered the nets into the murky water. We didn't talk about Julian, or the legacy fund, or the empty chair at the gala. We talked about the old days, about Arthur's terrible jokes, and about the way the river looked when the shrimp boats came home at dusk. As Chloe pulled up a net, her face bright with the simple joy of catching a blue crab, she looked over at me. "I know it's going to take time, Mom. To rebuild what I let drift away." "The river always finds its way back to the ocean, Chloe," I replied gently. "It just takes patience." Meanwhile, Maya's life had transformed in ways that made my heart swell with pride. The news of the Anchor Legacy Fund had spread far beyond the shipping offices of Savannah. Local and regional newspapers had picked up the story of the quiet logistics clerk who had turned down her own bonuses to honor the daughter of the crane operator who had saved her life. But Maya did not use the wealth to change her lifestyle. She continued to live in her small cottage, and she kept her job teaching at the public high school. Instead, she used the trust to establish the Lynn Vance Maritime and Robotics Scholarship. The program was designed to fund vocational training and engineering degrees for young men and women from the riverfront neighborhoods who otherwise could never have afforded college. A month after the gala, Maya invited Chloe and me to visit her classroom. The workshop was a chaotic, beautiful space filled with the smell of grease, solder, and sawdust. Dozens of teenagers were clustered around workbenches, some assembling small underwater ROVs, others rebuilding marine engines. A young girl with grease on her cheek walked up to us, her eyes shining as she pointed to a brand new CNC milling machine. "Mr. Holloway from the port said you're the reason we got these," the girl said, looking at me with a mixture of awe and gratitude. I shook my head, pointing to Maya, who was patiently helping a student solder a circuit board. "No, sweetheart. She is the reason. I just supplied the anchor. She's the one building the ship." Chloe stood beside me, watching Maya interact with the students. She saw the genuine respect in the teenagers' eyes, the way Maya listened to their questions with absolute patience, and the quiet authority she carried. "She really is David Lynn's daughter, isn't she?" Chloe whispered, her voice filled with a quiet admiration. "She is," I agreed. "And she is the best friend this family could have asked for." 6 months after my retirement, the Savannah Maritime Association invited me back to the Riverfront Convention Center. They were dedicating the Anchor Legacy Mentorship Program, an initiative inspired by our story that would pair experienced port logistics managers with young apprentices entering the maritime trades. The atmosphere in the auditorium was warm and celebratory, but the grand, formal tension of the previous gala was gone. This was an event for the people of the harbor, the crane operators, the dispatchers, the tugboat captains, and their families. As I walked down the center aisle of the auditorium, I looked toward the front row. The seat directly to the right of mine was not empty. Chloe was already sitting there, wearing a simple, elegant green dress that belonged to her, not to Julian's world. She had arrived nearly 40 minutes early to ensure she was there to greet me. On my left sat Maya, her brass compass resting on the table in front of her, a quiet symbol of the direction we had all found. When Richard Holloway took the podium and called my name to stand and be recognized, the applause was deafening. But as I stood up, I didn't look at the crowd or the flashing cameras of the local press. I looked at the two young women standing beside me. One connected to me by the blood in my veins, the other by a promise made to a dying friend in a quiet hospice room. I realized then that a legacy is not measured in the dollars we leave behind, or the buildings that bear our names. It is measured in the people who choose to stand beside us when the lights go down. We walked out of the auditorium together, the cool evening air of the Savannah River wrapping around us like a familiar shawl. Chloe reached out, her hand slipping into mine, her grip warm and steady. "Thank you, Mom," she whispered as we reached my old pickup truck. "For not giving up on me." I pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her close as the distant foghorn of a container ship echoed across the water. A mother never gives up on her daughter, Chloe. We just wait for the wind to change. If this story of the river and the harbor has touched your heart, do not wait for a grand retirement or a formal tribute to tell the people you love what they mean to you. Time is the one tide that never returns to the shore. Share this journey with someone who might need a reminder of what it means to show up, to forgive, and to keep the porch light burning for the ones who are still trying to find their way home. Lessons from this story. True loyalty and presence are more valuable than material wealth. Family relationships should never be treated as mere social or financial obligations. A legacy is defined by the lives we touch and the people who stand by us, not by monetary value. It is never too late to recognize one's mistakes, seek forgiveness, and rebuild broken bonds.